I know in the last couple years we've experienced a lot of public and personal events that have brought up the emotion anger. How do we process this? When do we know it's processed completely through our body? And what's the appropriate response as a mother, as a facilitator, as a friend? How do we hold space for this emotion? What does it mean? You're listening to Anatomy for Life with Crystal and Nicole, where we discuss the anatomy behind the most popular physical and spiritual practices so you can get the most out of these modalities on your healing journey. Crystal and Nicole are the partners of Zinn Yoga as previous business owners who share a passion for putting power, knowledge, intuition, and health back into your own hands. We've come together with Nicole's 20 years of marketing experience and wisdom through her own personal journey with chronic illness and alternative healing, and Crystal's 20 years of experience in the yoga industry teaching, facilitating, holding space for healing, and creating anatomy curriculums for yoga teachers, healers, and different movement modality training centers to provide you with online personal and professional development resources. Check out zinnyoga.com for our online courses and free resources for yoga instructors and healers. Satnam. Take a breath and then say something like, I see you, anger. Thank you for protecting me. Thank you for showing me where I need to take a deeper look. There's no shame in my response. These emotions are sacred. They're messengers. I see me, I forgive me, and I love me, and it's going to be okay. So welcome. Today is an episode that I was really excited to talk about as we continue having experience with emotions and talking about how those affect our health. And so today's episode is brought to you by anger.
And that is why I wore my Dolly Parton shirt, because you can't be angry when you got Dolly on your shirt.
I was wondering why you came in with that today, and I was like, it's adorable. I love it.
I mean, I'm a pretty hardcore Dolly lover, so.
Oh my gosh. There's so much on this subject, and I wasn't completely sure where we should start, except for I wanted to pose to our listeners to think of a time in your mind, the most recent time, or maybe the most catalytic time where you felt anger. And wanted to mention that often anger is a protective emotion and it's an unconscious response that comes up really quickly. And on the anatomy side, what anger does often is triggers your fight or flight response. So what's happening physiologically in your body is the fight or flight response, which is arousal and a lot of intense hormones flooding your body through your adrenal glands, catalyzing that process. It's a physical aggression. It dilates your pupils. You can breathe, obviously, a lot more efficiently. We know fight, flight, fawn, and freeze as that updated model. And so anything that you know about that model that plays into that factor is what happens when you get angry. So your bloodstream is now flooded with adrenaline and noradrenaline. And so I think I just wanted to start there and preface that when you have too high of a response like that physiologically, your memory is suppressed a little bit. You can't remember what happened during those times. It's more difficult to concentrate, and it can take hours and even days for that hormonal process to release through your body and cleanse the system. Your amygdala deals with emotions and your prefrontal cortex deals with the judgment, and all of that is going on in the moment of anger. So let's start there. And I wonder if Nicole might share any thoughts or personal experiences with anger, and maybe we can add those layers and apply that.
Yeah, just as you're talking about it, I think one of the first things that comes to my mind is I didn't really grow up in an angry household. It was pretty calm. And I remember having a very specific experience in high school. There was a guy that I knew really well, and I remember watching him get in a fight at school. And whenever it happened, it looked like he was like blank. Like I didn't even, it was like I wasn't even looking at the same person. I remember it was really like a scary moment for me. And he told me after that whenever he gets to that place that he doesn't remember what's even happening, and his body and his mind goes into another place. And me not having that kind of knowledge yet and understanding how the brain works, the things that get turned on and off in that process, I remember thinking like, is that just your excuse so that you can just go beat the crap out of that dude, you know? Like, I didn't really understand it, but then, like, I remembered that that stare in his eyes. It was like, people couldn't even, like, intervene almost and take him out of it. And it was, like, one of my first real, like, experiences of, like, seeing, like, a true anger response, you know? And I remember also, like, hearing stories, you know, you'd hear it in the news about, you know, all that adrenaline that comes in with the anger, right? People, you know, they become stronger. Like, you know, a lot of people would say, well, why do you get stronger whenever you're angry or whatever? And you hear these stories even, and it's using that same emotion, but you've heard people like lifting cars or whatnot, you know. And I just find it so fascinating how when we go into that state, how our mind almost goes into like sometimes that protective mode too, which makes us, you know, forgetting, which can be, a bad thing as well.
Well, when I read that, I was like, oh, that's why we're always arguing about what was said in moments of anger and fights. It's probably because both parties, if they're at that state of anger, your memory is compromised and your concentration is actually compromised. So that's not a helpful battle to have. So Paul Ekman, who does research for the Gottman Institute, says anger is one of the 6 basic emotions: disgust, fear, happiness, sadness, surprise, anger. And they also call it the anger iceberg because basically when you deconstruct anger, it's covering up, and what they call it is it protects raw emotions. And so there could be things like embarrassment, loneliness, depression, fear underneath the anger iceberg. And that's why it comes up. And that's also why it can be a very fast amygdala unconscious response to go from 0 to 100 before the person even knows what happened to themselves. And I know I've experienced that for sure, where that is a signal to me. And I always like to use emotions as messengers, especially anger, because that is just such a big signal to me about what is not being witnessed or taken care of in a consistent manner that led to the buildup to that kind of explosive reaction. Where it was most prevalent for me in my life, I was going to tell you about, and you already know a little bit about this, but I'll share it with the listeners, was the year that my husband had been deployed for 14 months, and I was pregnant with my 3rd baby, and so she was born during that deployment. And during that period of time, which is always stressful, you know, and you're maneuvering through different things, and a lot of times I am in fight or flight and survival mode, and that's okay. Some things are necessary temporarily. But this particular time in deployment, I had experienced a lot of anger, a lot of explosive anger like I had not really experienced before.
Yeah.
And it was very shocking to me and also overwhelming, and just like, what do I do with this? Because you think you know what's going on, you have a handle on things, but in this particular instance, it kind of surprised me. I've never had more support, right? My life has never been happier. Yes, it's a difficult thing to go through. No, it's not the first time I've been through it. And so I just wasn't completely aware of what was underneath that anger iceberg. And so I actually worked through that year when I was pregnant. I had a lot of acupuncture done. I did a lot of ART therapy. And what came up was actually things from my childhood and ways of being, things through, you know, earlier periods of my life, different relationships, that current scenario was triggering. So it wasn't that current scenario itself was like what was actually causing it, but the abandonment issues and the not witnessing and like the not allowing emotions when you're in a situation like that was triggering underlying trauma and wounds that hadn't been addressed. So I went through that mostly the entire time, and even after I had my 3rd baby, I continued in these practices, and I actually went back to my advanced yoga sequence and teacher. And so once the baby was born, I could go back to that, and I worked a lot of that out somatically and physically with that teacher for the following year, and also learned that it affected my liver in depth. And I do have a post on the Zinn Yoga Instagram about what processes your liver participates in and how anger can block those and affect those, and what's going on there. So at that time, after my baby was done nursing, I did a very intense liver cleanse as well. And all of those things helped me in the period of about a year to 18 months. And I started having the lack or not having those anger responses or feeling that emotion come up out of nowhere, because I had to deconstruct and address some of those things. Also during that period, it was really interesting that my oldest daughter had gone through some similar things during a breakup and anger. And so this is very fascinating, because I wanted to teach the full process of not just feeling the emotion and having it come up, but because it takes days just to re-regulate from that one experience, and then it takes months and years sometimes to uncover what was that original wound and trigger, and this is just part of our journey. We just work through it. It has to completely process out. It's also a very somatic emotion, so you do have to move it through your body, which is why I think going back to my advanced yoga practice kind of completed the integration of the cycle, because I didn't really see the relief of those responses until I was able to go back to that and completely move it through my body. So she had got with a friend one day, and she was very upset, and she was working through these emotions, and I let them take a bunch of my old glass dinner plates in a safe way, in plastic bags where glass wouldn't get anywhere or hurt anybody in a public space, or couldn't get left anywhere. And they found a location and they smashed them. Awesome. And they got it through their body, and then I made them shake it out, and then they kind of danced and they laughed, and then they got sodas. But you have to go all the way through the process and not just be in the anger and the smashing. And so that was my most recent and kind of complete experience, is how I've been understanding the anger, how to process it, and how to move through all of those things.
I love that you said it that way, and how you gave the visual of the iceberg. I think that's just so helpful, because I think the more that we see it, it is kind of, again, like that PTSD response, right? It sounds like even whenever you went through that during the deployment, it wasn't necessarily exactly what you were in at the time, but it triggered that. And it's oftentimes a compilation of things where, sometimes people say, and they just snapped. Right?
Yeah.
And you've never previously experienced that. And I remember when for the first time I experienced that emotion, and I had to break it all down. And I too realized it was almost like a PTSD response that was linked into something else. And so I love that message that we're always talking about on here of moving through it and completing the work. It's never complete, right? But
till the next
going
thing.
till the next thing. But processing it in a healthy way, getting the help where you need it, because what I've seen, I have some loved ones who have dealt with some pretty intense anger things, and a lot of it is, I think, sometimes stemming from whether it's, you weren't seen as a child, or whatever the trauma was from childhood or from past relationships, or things that your parents did that that you learned from.
Well, let's talk about that, because how is the emotion, and we can talk about other emotions, but how is the emotion anger dealt with? What were we told as kids? Is that allowed? And how is that responded to?
And that's right. I think that a lot of times it used to be, you can't respond that way. You can't do that.
What were you told? If you were to get angry as a child?
Yeah, I think the earlier generation, I don't know. I had a pretty strong personality as a kid. Maybe you can't imagine that.
What?
No. But, like I said, I didn't grow up in an angry household, but I was in the era that if I really acted out, I was going to maybe get the belt. you know. I wouldn't say it happened very often, but it did. I don't think I was told not to have anger, because I don't think I really was like anger, or an angry child. But
But was there subconscious messages going on? Because even if we don't exhibit the behavior, because in my environment, I was not allowed to exhibit a very wide range of emotions, just period. And that was an inferred understanding from divorce, from being scared, from abandonment. I don't think anyone ever came out and told me, you're not allowed to get upset, you're not allowed to cry. But it was an inferred understanding and energy based on the fact that, like, when people get upset, you lose your daddy, right? Like, when emotions are high, mommy's crying and people are hurt and that's my fault and things like that. And so I also think that even if you weren't directly told, which a lot of kids are directly told, calm down. How many times have you been upset and your husband or someone else has said, calm down?
Oh, yeah. And
that is a way that you are sending the message that it is not allowed to have the emotion and the breath and width, and you're not allowed to feel it for what it is, and there's something bad about it. So whether you're directly told or it's inferred, I do think it's pretty common, and it was the case in my case, that there was ideas that I set in there that it is not okay to be in that range.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. I think we did talk things out quite a bit as a family in my household. But I have other people in my life that I'm really close with where, like, there wasn't that. And then yelling would just erupt, and then things wouldn't get, there was no process for fixing. And it was just yelling battles, right?
Oh, so just kind of living in that yell of emotion, but then no talking it out.
And no working through it, right? And so then that can manifest in terrible ways, I think, as an adult. If you've never learned how to regulate, you've never learned how to process through emotions. And sometimes I think even getting to the point where you can recognize, why is this happening? Why do I have such a strong emotion, even for the smallest things? Like, what is causing those triggers? How can I recognize those triggers and not react in them? And I liked what you said about, like, what were you told as a child, because my husband and I have been talking to him lately, because we have a pretty strong-willed 2-year-old, right? And so sometimes she's just screaming and crying. She's in the terrible twos, and sometimes I think my husband's just like, oh my gosh, I'm going to lose my mind. Like any parent gets to that point sometimes. And I've heard him say to her a few times, stop crying, just stop crying. And I've said to him, and it's made him stop and think, I've said, if you were, I think sometimes we think that we can just treat like children differently. Like we can just be the enforcer over them, right? Like they're then invalidating their feelings, as you were saying. And I've said to him, like, have you ever been in that mode where you're so angry, and if somebody just yelled at you, stop crying, would it make you want to cry more, or would it make you go, oh, okay, yeah, I'm just going to stop crying?
Yeah.
Right? And he goes, oh, that's a good point.
Yeah.
And so learning to be able, when you're in those moments where you feel so upset, anger, all the things, to be able to step back and actually see somebody in their emotion. And the next time it happened, I said, watch what I'm going to do with her. And I'm not the expert in this. I get angry, but something that you and I have talked a lot about, and you gave me some awesome tips as well from having a strong-willed child. And in fact, I just did this with her yesterday when she was having a tantrum, and I just stopped and I looked her in the eye, and she's 2, okay? Mm-hmm. And she still understood that I was seeing her, and I said, Hope, are you upset right now? And she just kind of stopped and sat there for a minute, and then she nodded I waited for the response. She nodded her head, and I said, do you want a hug from Mama? And she climbed right into my lap, and that is what she needed. She doesn't know how to regulate those emotions. She's 2, right? And I think for me, it's just a learning experience over and over to realize how much we need to witness other people and their emotions and allow them to have them in appropriate ways, Obviously we don't want it to turn to abuse or anything that's negative.
Yeah, make sure, and teach appropriate behavior, but allow for the full range of the emotion. I love that you did that. What I love so beautifully is that you didn't even have to say it necessarily, but what you did showed her that she's allowed to feel like that, and she will be responded to with mirroring and empathy. I really like what the Gottman Institute says about this. They give the 3 steps with someone in anger or high emotion is, 1, when you're the witness, don't take it personally. Step 2 is don't tell them to calm down, so don't stop it. Completely allow it and say you're allowed to have this emotion. And then step 3 is all the other things like the resolution, and the Gottman Institute is specifically in between spousal relationships, right? So there's a little bit different view in there than in my parenting classes and whatnot. But step 3 is like, what do we do about it, the resolution and all of the fallout. But I think step 1 and 2 are just the most important. Don't take it personally and allow for it. And that would be another step, is like, you're allowed to have the emotion, but this behavior is not appropriate. I'm not going to let you do that. Like, that's another thing. But it's so beautiful that just in her energetic center, she knows now that if I'm upset, that's okay, because mommy allowed for that and gave me a hug. And that is obviously the first step when we're dealing with anger. And I think because of the message of anger, and specifically anger and violent outbreaks and things like that, the stigma is just much stronger. And there's not an arena for it. And the messaging is there is no way to have that. Either we control it or we repress it, or you can't be around us, or you're not acceptable, or you scare us, or all of the messaging surrounding that may be direct or indirect. That's also a lot of times set in childhood, is what makes anger so tricky. And you really have to be witnessed by someone who really has been through it and can regulate, right?
Yeah.
So that, I think it's a big one. And by the time this episode comes out, we will have done our retreat in Costa Rica, me and Megan's retreat, but we are doing a portion on this here where we're going to hold space and allow. It's going to be really cool. We'll probably share some with you or tell you about it after. We're going to allow some of that to come out. Witness it, hold it, but not stop there. We're going to cry it out, dance, party it out, move it somatically through your body, because the best way to get these hormones flushed out of your body, once the response is there and you've done the work to decide where the original wound is and you moved it through your body, if you re-regulate through somatic exercise, through dancing or laughing or something else, that flushes your body out faster. So you're not just ruminating in it for days, kind of wondering like, what happened? What went on?
Yeah, same thing like with an anxiety response or
Yes.
attack, right? Like the best thing you can do is not crawl up in a ball. It's move that body, hum, do the thing,
shake
move
it
your
out,
arms, shake
trauma
it out.
shaking. Yeah.
Yeah.
But this is a deep one. This is something that has been meaningful to me, and something I feel like I'm on a mission, like when you see it happening to your baby, or I see it happening to someone in public, or my child or someone, I feel that kind of fiery defense to come to that person's defense and be like, you be angry. You let it out, right? Like,
Do
I'm
it.
I'm always telling people, does that make you angry? Like, you're allowed to feel that, right? Mm-hmm. And I feel like it's super powerful. I also feel like it's a really reclamatory, or it's a reclamation of the divine feminine sacred rage and anger as well, that we have and will be witnessed and needs to be integrated. It's not something to be locked away, but you got to do your work to be able to stand in it.
Yeah.
And I hope this was helpful for our listeners. I know it's helpful for me to continue to talk about it because it's always going to come up. Hopefully it's helpful for people in your lives. I know that you do have those places in your lives and personal experience surrounding it. And I think to stand in it with compassion and allow for the emotion, and then, address the behavior and the underlying wounds later, is probably the best idea. And I will link in the show notes a lot of these studies and research I've got in the Gottman Institute. And if people are interested, reach out and make comments about acupuncture, ART, places where I have found relief, boxing gyms, and I'm happy to dole out recommendations and things that have helped me.
Yeah. And I think just, something, if I could give any recommendation to the listeners today, is think on some of those responses you've had, and where can you witness yourself in those responses. And what I think is really cool, and something that I've learned over the years, is when you can actually witness yourself in those responses and recognize when you're in those, I feel like you gain a lot of power and control over your life as well. Because at that point, then you can make decisions for how you can work through those, what you can do to process and to move forward. And, always having it be important that we can't ever force others in their responses, but we can help to shape things possibly and create new pathways.
Absolutely. I love that. This is what I'll leave them with then. Here's one easy, simple step. When you, for you yourself, because you have to do it for you yourself first, if this comes up for you, take a breath and then say something like, I see you, anger. Thank you for protecting me. Thank you for showing me where I need to take a deeper look. There's no shame in my response. I did what I had to do. These emotions are sacred. They're messengers. I see me, I forgive me, and I love me, and it's going to be okay. And check out the YouTube for lots of free meditations. The one we released this week is called Fists of Anger, to help you move it through your body, but always remember to compassionately witness first. That's okay. Having that emotion is okay.
Yeah, and the last thing I want to leave you with is, if you are a yoga instructor or healer, we have some awesome new resources that are getting ready to come out, where we're creating so many wonderful and free resources. There is Zinn Yoga library that we're going to have up in just a matter of a couple of days. So by the time this is out, it will be available, and you can go to our Instagram to learn more. And we just want to serve and give you so many wonderful things to help you on your journey.
Satnam.
Satnam.